Wunderbar. Ich glaube,
Great.
wir dürfen
I
schon
believe that we can
einen Soft Start hier
try
machen.
for a
Danke
soft
vielmals
start.
auch
Thank you very
für
much
das respektvolle Einhalten
for
der
respecting
Beginnzeit und vor allem
schedule.
Ihnen allen, uns allen ein herzliches Willkommen beim
Welcome all of you.
feministischen Jahresauftakt
Feminist,
unseres Landes,
annual
und man hat
kickoff
das
of our
Gefühl, er war
country.
nie
And we get the
nötiger
impression
denn
that it
jetzt.
was
Ein herzliches Willkommen.
more vital than now. So a cordial welcome to all of you.
Ein herzliches Willkommen Ihnen, euch allen hier
Cordial welcome
im
to all of you
Parlament
here
und ein
in
herzliches
the Austrian
Willkommen
Parliament, and a
euch
cordial
und
welcome
Ihnen,
also
die
to
auf
the
einem
participants
Livestream hier
joining
zugeschaltet
us via
sind.
the live stream.
Das Verständnis, dass das
Thank you for understanding that
Parlament limitiert ist.
space here in the Parliament is limited, so thank you for taking the time to join us. My name is Sonja Kato, and I'm pleased to welcome you not only here at the 11th Barbara-Prammer-Symposium, but this is already the 11th time that I've been the moderator of this important and really highly relevant event. It's organized by the SPÖ Women, the Rennes Institute, the SPÖ Venture Club, and FEPS, Federation of European Progressive Studies. We are very pleased that so many of you have joined us on this Friday.
Nicht nur
The
herausfordernd sind für
political
die
landscape
Demokratie,
currently is not
sondern
only a challenge
vermutlich
for
eine
democracy,
massive Zäsur in Sachen Frauenpolitik, gar nicht zu reden von
have a major impact on
fortschrittlicher
women's
Frauenpolitik
policies,
bringen werden.
and
Ich glaube, umso wichtiger
progressive women's
ist daher das heutige Symposium, dieser Pfad, den wir gemeinsam auf dem Weg in eine feministische und vor allem gemeinsame Zukunft weiterdenken und beschreiten. Es braucht Licht in dunklen Zeiten und wir können und müssen dieses Licht sein. Danke dafür. Über Geld, Macht, Gleichstellung und Gender Budgeting zu sprechen, das mag angesichts der täglich neuen Details, die aus den Verhandlungen zwischen ÖVP und FPÖ durchdringen und einen drohenden Sozialabbau, gar nicht zu reden von massiven Einschnitten in die Klimapolitik und anderem, utopisch wirken. Und trotzdem, glaube ich, liegt genau darin die Chance, dass wir uns gemeinsam verorten an dem, was wir in eine gute gemeinsame Zukunft bringen wollen. Und Gemeinsamkeit zeigt sich nicht nur an dem Weg, den auf Basis dessen, was wir im Barbara-Prammer-Symposium Jahr für Jahr verorten, entsteht, sondern die Gemeinsamkeit zeigt sich auch anhand der vielen Gäste und Teilnehmenden, die heute hier sind. Und erlauben Sie mir bitte, dass ich ein paar namentlich begrüße. Zuallervorderst unserer Gastgeberin einen herzlichen Dank und vor allem ein herzliches Willkommen, zweite Nationalratspräsidentin und Direktorin des Karl-Renner-Instituts, Doris Burres. Danke, dass wir hier sein dürfen. Herzlichen Dank fürs Kommen und danke auch für die Unterstützung seitens des SPÖ-Clubs, dem Club- und Parteivorsitzenden der SPÖ. Ein herzliches Willkommen, Andreas Babler. Ein Riesendanke für die Organisation des
Barbara-Prammer-Symposium, once again supported by her wonderful team, the Federal Women's Chair, Eva Maria Holzleitner, member of the Austrian Parliament.
And Kata Tütö, Deputy Mayor of Budapest and member of the European Committee, Kata is future member of the European Committee of the Regions, and we are very pleased to have Sita Gurmai with us today. Happy to have you, PES Women President. I'm not only president of the PES Women, but a lifetime friend to late Barbara, so thank you very much for being with us. Ein besonderes Willkommen.
Special welcome to the former Women's Minister and the founder of the Barbara-Prammer-Symposium, Gabriele Heinisch-Hossek, former Member of Parliament and Minister. And I'm very pleased that I can welcome two icons of our movement, the former Federal Minister of Education, Barbara Havlicek, and Vice Mayor Renate Brauner, who's also held numerous other positions. It's great to have you. It is a great honor to have the social partners represented with such high-ranking and distinguished members. A cordial welcome to our President of the Chamber of Labour, Renate Anderl. A cordial welcome also to the Vice President of the Austrian Trade Union Federation, Corinna Schumann. It is with great pleasure that we can welcome so many members of the Austrian National Council, the Austrian Parliament. I hope I've recorded everybody. Selma Yildirim, Julia Herr, Pia-Marinda Willinger, Verena Nussbaum, Katrin Auer, Michaela Schmidt, Elke Handorsch, Sabine Schatz, Wolfgang Moitzi, and Jan Kreiner. Apologies if I missed any of you. Thank you for coming. On behalf of the Federal Council, we have Claudia Abra and Elisabeth Grimling, and for numerous officials from local administrations, we have Salmina Ahmad and Sabine Jankovic, so thank you for being here. I'm also pleased that we have some of the most important feminist voices from Lower Austria here. Welcome to Ulrike Königsberger. A cordial welcome to the two managing directors, Sandra Breiteneder and Klaus Seltenheim. And now she managed to find her seat. A cordial welcome to the chairpersons of the two major youth organizations of the Austrian Social Democratic Movement, Michi Kögel and Paul Stich. Thank you for being here. Also I'd like to welcome the director of the Karl-Renner Institute, Maria Malcznik. Thank you and your team for the support. And there are two chairwomen of the regional movements, Peter Oberauer. Thank you for coming. And of course, the heart piece, if you will, of the Barbara-Prammer Symposiums, as well as high-ranking keynote speakers. This is an impetus of new ideas and important information that will help us to engage in good feminist policies. We have Diane Ellison, Professor Emeritus of the University of Exeter.
Your keynote, Diane Ellison. Und wir freuen uns auch.
And we're also very pleased to have the chief economist of the Momentum Institute, Katharina Mader, who will also be giving a keynote. So Katharina, thank you very much for being here. And it is with special gratitude and I told Ruth Manninger something that was wrong. Actually, I would like to welcome the speakers of the workshops. Anna Schultheis and Ursula Bauer will be joining us, and Annika Dahlen. So thank you very much for making yourselves available for the workshops and the panel discussions. we're almost there. But it's also important to say thank you to the many women coming from the various women's associations, from civil society and business circles with whom we work closely here at the Barbara-Prammer-Symposium, and also the Social Democratic Women's Movement, working closely with these women's associations. So I'd like to welcome Claudia Friebel in lieu of all the others. Welcome. And on my welcome list, there's also Dolores Schmiedinger. I didn't see her, but anyway, let us welcome her. And I guess she had at least planned to join us. And anyway, this is a nice segue, a good transition, not only because culture played a big role in the life of Barbara-Prammer, but also because companions of Barbara are joining us every year. Helfried Karl and the longtime friend and recipient of the first Barbara-Prammer Award, Anneliese Zimmermann. A cordial welcome to you. At least Helfried Karl is here, her former office manager, and Anneliese is on her way, I guess. So a big thank you for being so loyal to our symposium, and thank you for having shared family and friends of Barbara-Prammer with us. So thank you very much for being so loyal and for always attending our symposium. I'd also like to thank all those who are participating online, whom these words of welcome are maybe a bit boring, but I guess it is important for us to show how broad-based this symposium is here. Some housekeeping remarks, some technical comments. If you want to have English or German interpretation, I hope that everybody's been asked whether you need a headset, so there's always a possibility of getting a headset if you don't speak good English or German. And we have wonderful interpretation into English and German, and we also have a barrier-free broadcast, and we also have sign language interpreters here in the room, so a big thank you to the two interpretation teams. Thank you for having us. The Barbara-Prammer-Symposium, and I have to tell you, this will be recorded. So pictures will be taken, as you have noticed, and there will also be a separate page on the website of the SPO Women. There will be a link that will take you to the keynotes and the results of the workshops. And I would like to thank all the representatives of the media, either here in the room or who are joining us online. So now we've made it. You can fasten your seatbelts. We will start right away with the contents of the Barbara-Prammer-Symposium. And first I would like to hand over to the chairman of SPO, the Social Democratic Party, Andreas Babler. Thank you very much. You cannot do this yourself, but I can thank you, dear Sonja, for this very nice and extremely competent moderation of this event. And for all of you, dear comrades, thank you very much for the invitation. Thank you for allowing us to be with you today and to speak some words of welcome. This is a very impressive, and as usual, this will be a very powerful symposium that I have the privilege of joining. Now I heard that we have several hundred registrations again this year, and I can tell you these are days that give us a lot of strength. Sometimes in these difficult political circumstances that this country is threatened with, and in light of the current political development, we also need events such as this one. You need these events, you need to get together, you need to feel this strength, this power. The organization of so many women's associations, and you represent thousands and thousands of women. And let us give each other this strength, this courage, this confidence we need. We need to assume all these roles that are necessary in this democracy. I think you know this quote, which is a quote from a man, Antonio Gramsci. It's one of my favorite quotes, which expresses just that. And I will read this quote to make sure I won't make any mistakes. Educate yourselves, we need all your wisdom. Move, we need all your enthusiasm. And get organized, we need all your strength. And this is an appeal to go out in the coming months, and also the women's organizations should go out and join up and exhort other women to get organized, because we know that we'll need a lot of strength and we need a lot of organized comrades and women, and we need to organize more women in order to resist against this backlash that this country is threatened with. And we will need all this combined strength because Austria is facing a government that presents women with a double challenge. Firstly, and we know this, and the economists who will be giving us keynote presentations today know that such strict austerity measures hit women particularly hard. We know that. We've seen this in the UK and in Greece, as well as in Argentina. These austerity measures are always imposed on women first. They're most affected. So, secondly, with the Freedom Party, the FPO, we are threatened with a major backlash in women's policy. The idea of women of the FPO is dating back to the 50s. And also the FPO's spokeswoman for Women's Affairs has unequivocally summarized the party's view of women to give birth to children, start a family, take care of them, and protect and shelter them, and above all educate them to become high achievers. That's the words of the spokeswoman for Women's Affairs of the Women's Party, of the People's Party, of the FPO, the Freedom Party. In the government program of the Lower Austrian Coalition states that work is to be done on financial support for childcare in the family unit. That means that mothers, more rarely fathers, as you know, so especially mothers are to receive financial support if they care for the children at home for a long time. That's a hidden stay-at-home parenting bonus, and it promotes unpaid work by women. That's still applicable. So this promotes unpaid work by women. That's a sober finding of one of these federal states, namely Lower Austria, where we already have such a coalition of the People's Party with the Freedom Party. So the Freedom Party says we don't need measures like gender budgeting. Yet projects like the one in Lower Austria show that the Freedom Party is doing exactly that. It is politically coloring the budget, but only at the expense of women, because the budget is so important. We also need to stand up for women. In the coalition negotiations, we tried to stand up for women, especially when it came to the budget issues. For us, the expansion of childcare, public transport, and the implementation of gender budgeting goals were central. This includes the development of a comprehensive gender equality strategy and the closing of the data gap. The People's Party waited until the last minute to reveal the full picture of the budget disaster they caused. And now they're negotiating with a party that couldn't care less about women's rights. Let's take the example of pensions. Women receive around 40% lower pensions than men. The difference in Austria is greater than almost anywhere else. The reasons for this are lower wages, a lot of unpaid work, part-time work, not enough childcare facilities, and not enough credit for maternity leave. The pension cuts in 2003 of the former far-right coalition hit women particularly hard, and the effects are still being felt today. And what did the OVP, the People's Party, and the NEOs propose in the coalition negotiations? To raise the retirement age. They are once again forgetting women who are already we are already seeing the retirement age being raised. So slowly raising the retirement age of women to bring it up to par with men. So the women are already affected by a raising of the retirement age. And the cost-cutting measures already presented will also particularly affect women. These two parties have announced that they will make savings in public transport and to abolish the option of additional income for the unemployed. These are also budgetary decisions that will particularly affect women. And I'm sure that today and here we are only learning about some of the horrors that are yet to come and that will be threatening women. Because when the People's Party and the Freedom Party mention freedom of choice, well, there can be no question of this if there is no comprehensive free provision of childcare. There can be no question of this if the decriminalization of abortion is under discussion. So this is also possible under the FPO. So we said that abortion should be taken out of penal law, the penal code, and it should be put where it belongs, namely in the field of health. It's a health issue, not a criminal issue. So there is a risk that with a simple majority, these rights that we have fought for decades, either in government or in opposition, so that these policies might be abolished again. So that's what we need to do. We need to be vigilant, we need to get organized, we need to get stronger. We need to seek the dialogue with civil society, with women's initiatives also outside of Parliament. And we need to get organized. We need to increase our battle strength when we're in opposition. That's what we can and have to do. So it's an important democratic aspect. We need to resist in Parliament, but also outside of Parliament when it comes to networking with civil society, women's initiatives, women's organizations that are fighting for the right of women to be upheld in this republic. As Barbara-Prammer repeatedly reminded us, the quality of a democracy can be measured by how it treats women's rights. As the first female president of the National Council, she not only opened the door for women to hold the highest political offices in this country, she also strengthened the democratic foundations of our country. And among these democratic foundations, we also have gender budgeting at the constitutional level. Barbara-Prammer was a pioneer in the fight for women's rights and democracy. She fought for 50-50, or to set up centers to protect women against violence, for the legal anchoring of this protection against violence. She brought young people into Parliament, and she was a campaigner for against child poverty and children's rights. Solidarity and cohesion were her central themes, and they remain so for us today. That's her legacy of this fighter that Barbara-Prammer was. Barbara was always keen to point out that women's achievements should not be taken for granted. Each and every one of us bears responsibility for those things. And she's right. We all bear responsibility for how this country is shaped in future. Because I can promise you one thing. The Social Democratic Party, you know that this is important to me, will always stand by every single woman when it comes to ensuring her rights are upheld. It is not the task of women's organizations. I'm convinced that this is our common struggle. Men and women need to ensure women's rights. It's not only the women's organizations, but men and women in the social democratic movement need to fight for women's rights. It is our goal to live together in a society based on equal rights, where we really have equality, in which women and men divide up paid and unpaid work equally, and in which women and men receive the same pay for work of equal value. These are fundamental principles of social democracy to make sure this applies to women and men in the entire movement in our party. So this requires a budget policy that makes sure that it is easier in future to share care work and gainful employment. And even if the next years do not bode well for us, it will be up to us, Social Democrats, to defend these rights and to remind the government to ensure that women's rights are not negotiable. They are not negotiable in this republic. They are an indicator of how a society wants to deal with each other. It will be up to civil society to stand up and to make themselves heard when important achievements are threatened. We need to stand side by side with the SPO women and the entire party. And with a view to the government that is about to be formed, I would like to end my speech with a quote from Barbara-Prammer. Justice means that the weaker, the disadvantaged, and the poorer are not marginalized, but are compensated by commitments made by the stronger and the richer. I wish you all a great exchange with exciting discussions at this wonderful symposium. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andreas Babler. Thank you very much for opening this symposium. And before we come to the opening talk, I would like to introduce two guests. Sandra Konstatsky, the head of the Equal Treatment Commission and also Member of Parliament, Andreas Leimer. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for coming. This is absolutely great. It is very important to know that we are many, and this is why it is also very important to welcome all the participants, online participants and offline participants, so that we can see that we have a very broad network that is meeting here, and I could continue this list forever. I would like to thank all the participants most cordially. Now I would like to ask you to give it up for the traditional opening talk, and to welcome President of the National Council and President of the Karl Renner Institute, Doris Bures. Please come on stage. This is already a beloved tradition, a most cordial welcome. Please give it up for Eva Maria Holzleitner, the Federal Representative for Women's Affairs. And we are very grateful about the cooperation with the Foundation for European Progressive Studies. Cordial welcome to Laszlo Andor, the Secretary General of the Foundation for European Progressive Studies. Dear Doris, let me start with you. Thank you very much for giving us the opportunity to have this symposium at the Austrian Parliament. But let's go back in history. 15 years ago, there was a women's minister, and there was gender budgeting brought about by this women's minister, and this was elevated to a constitutional rank. And this is something that is very important. It's very important to talk about this topic. Thank you very much for your foresight, for your vision, but also for telling us that integrating gender budgeting into the constitution is very important, especially in times where political changes are pending. But what else would we need in terms of improvement? Where do the problems lie? Where do we have to be extremely careful when it's about distributing money for women, which is part and parcel for gender budgeting? Where do we have to be careful? Where do we have to be even more alert? Thank you very much, dear Sonia. So we always have to be careful. So in that regard, this could be a very short answer, but please give me the opportunity to also say a most cordial thank you to you, Eva Maria, for the excellent organization of the Barbara-Prammer-Symposium. So every year we are confronted with different domestic policy situations. This is the moment where we join forces, where we come together and where we truly feel that it's so important to join forces, to link up and to fight together. And as for each women's policy progress, well, we can only achieve it if we join forces, if we pull in concert, and if together we fight for this feminist and women's policy progress. We are doing just that. You talked about our humble beginnings 15 years ago, but of course we have been standing on the shoulders of our pioneers for a very long time. And in women's organizations, we see time and again that our predecessors play a very important role for us. We are grateful to them for the achievements on which can build. Just think about Johanna Donal, of course, our beloved Barbara-Prammer, Eva Maria, so we mentioned Helga Konrad, Gabi Heinisch-Hossek, of course, and today we have Eva Maria, and we are very proud that you are at the helm of this very strong women's organization. And Sonja already mentioned it. Way back then, 15 years ago, we adopted gender budgeting unanimously in Parliament and elevated it to a constitutional act. So we managed to do that because thus, and there is no doubt what is going to happen now that a conservative right-wing government is pending. So it's very important to heed these achievements. Everything that we managed to achieve that has been elevated to the rank of constitutional provisions. So this is something that we have to put our trust in. Of course, it's very important to fill provisions and progressive women's policy provisions with life. So it's not only about gender budgeting, it's also about proceeding to action. And I would like to cite two examples because Renate Brauner was welcomed. So when I started out in the women's organization of the SPO, when I was a very young woman, so we started a campaign and we said that we need money for street lighting because there are several public spaces where women are truly afraid. So this is something that we have started, and this has been one of the predecessors of gender budgeting, because we said we should not only spend money where it's for the benefit of men, it's also about public investment, public spending, making lives easier for women, taking fear away from women. And after the gender budget adoption in Parliament, I became infrastructure minister, and I took a very close look at the situation. I asked myself, what does this mean for me as a transport and infrastructure minister? And I took a close look at the difference between mobility behavior between men and women. And of course, we are also facing massive inequalities when it comes to public transport. Just take a look at the number of commuters. So we have more male commuters, and we have gone to great strides in order to foster mobility when it comes to reaching the workplace. So women are faced with a different situation because they need short connections. And in the ministry, we said that it's very important to take a close look at mobility of women, and it's very important to invest more. And today, you will hear many more examples. So I just mentioned two examples, but it's those little steps that lead to more justice. So it's these baby steps taken time and again that we need in order to make women's lives more just, more equitable, and in order also to enhance distribution of public means. These are the policy measures that we need, and please allow me, while talking about domestic policy developments, to say that we have a strong liberal democracy, and we are going to maintain and defend this strong liberal democracy. We are the ones who know that democracy is stronger than division. We are the ones standing for democracy based on consensus and not based on conflict. We are the ones fighting for equitable distribution, equal opportunities, solidarity in society. And I wanted to mention this aspect because this solidarity is so important to us. Solidarity between the genders, solidarity at all political levels, and I'm firmly convinced that we are going to need this solidarity in the future, because we have seen the negotiations at a federal policy level, and of course we know that these negotiations will be to the detriment of some groups of society. The next political attack of this turning of the era brought about by conservative right-wing men will be against this city of Vienna, this city based on solidarity, starting from which we spread humanism, living together in the spirit of solidarity. So there will be a political concept, a political notion that will attack socialist Vienna, and this day will come, and then we are going to show what we are made of, and the Social Democrat women will be at the helm of this resistance movement. Doris, on fire as always. This is absolutely great. Your fire is truly warming our hearts. So next year, the women's program for the city of Vienna is going to celebrate its 30th anniversary. So the program that was instigated by Barbara-Prammer. Thank you very much. Dear Doris, dear Eva, I think being an Upper Austrian, and also for you in your capacity as a member of parliament, as deputy chair of the parliamentary club, I think this Barbara-Prammer-Symposium always gives you a lot of energy, although it requires a lot of effort. Gender equality is something that has also coined your political life for many years now. And Doris said it quite clearly here on stage that this gender equality needs real representation in measures, in figures, in day-to-day achievements. You have developed many parliamentary motions with regard to gender budgeting. It's very important, as Doris has said, to state the fact that maybe the big progress has not been brought about, but sticking to the ball is so important. Continue fighting is so important. Will this be enough? Will tenacity be enough? Tenacity is something that is absolutely necessary. Without any doubt, of course, we need more, we need courage, we need confidence, we need vision, we need lots of energy over the years to come. But I would also like to take this opportunity to say that the motto of this year's Barbara-Prammer Symposium is something that is dear to my heart. also in my own parliamentary group, in my own party. So very often we lack enthusiasm, but if you are passionate about parliamentary work, then the budget process, the budget dreamt up by a government is so passionate, is so important, and gender budgeting is so necessary. The gender budgeting perspective is so important. And this is why I think that especially in the years to come, this topic will be totally important, because after times are fraught with crises, of course, our women's issues are even more important. Austerity measures have been announced this week. It's not only about the way we spend money. It's not only the way we spend money that will have an impact on gender budgeting, but it's also the way that we shape our revenues, and this will also have an impact on the development of gender equality. I would like to cite a very current example. Educational parental leave should be done away with. A reform of this system, of course, this would have been necessary, but doing away with it entirely also means so that many women will be left by the wayside. And after this announcement, I received many messages from women who said it's a shame. So I could do my A levels due to this program, so I could achieve further education and opened up valuable perspectives. And so many important things, so many important aspects where we think that they are going to disappear in the years to come. And of course, this causes me a lot of headache. We need this courage, we need this resistance, and especially seen from a gender budgeting perspective, it's very important to shed light on each individual measure. And we also know that the climate bonus has an impact on gender budgeting. Doris already mentioned it, because the way women use mobility is totally different, but they still have totally different incomes. And so it truly makes a difference whether the CO2 price tag or other climate sanctioning measures are compensated for or not. So this is going to hit women. And this is why I'm very happy that we have this Barbara-Prammer-Symposium and that we are talking about power, money, and gender equality, because it will be a central tool over the years to come that we will have to put to good use, and we will have to bank on further development of gender budgeting. So we know that this holistic view when it comes to the gender equality strategy is still not existent. In Austria, individual gender equality objectives are important, but of course it is also necessary to link up all these individual goals and to see what is the impact on gender budgeting as a whole. And this holistic view is still lacking, and maybe this has been a conscious decision that many data are not disclosed, that many data are not provided to science. And as Katharina Marder is one of our keynote speakers, I think it's very important to talk about a survey on the way time is used. And it's so important to provide data and insights to science in order to generate added value. And we should not only trust in the figures that are presented, individual aspects that are presented by individual politicians. It's very important to also put a holistic and independent view of science to good use. And this is also something that will gain in importance in the next years. Because if we take a look at the measures of the last government. Way back then, each figure was controlled before it was disclosed and published, and this is why it will be so important to protect science, to protect independent science, especially when we are talking about data and figures, when it's about honest answers. Science and research are our partners when it comes to reaching equality, when it comes to the distribution of money. Thank you very much for thanking me for the organization of the Barbara-Symposium, but it's not me alone doing all the preparatory work. So it's the team of the Austrian Parliament, it's the team of the Parliamentary Club, about the Women's Organization of SPO, of the Renner Institute, and also of FEPS, who have done a stellar job in the preparation phase and having organized everything. And we are very happy about the hundreds of registration, but of course they also mean that we have to great length in terms of organization. And we are very happy that we have such a motivated team. So thank you very much to each participant and to each contributor of this Barbara-Prammer-Symposium. Thank you very much, Eva Maria Holz-Leitner. Thank you very much for talking about the necessity of tenacity. Thank you very much. So this has worked out quite well, and we can see this looking around.
Of today's Barbara-Prammer-Symposium, and we were chatting about, and since Eva Maria was mentioning it as well, and of course Doris too, 25 years ago we already had a similar situation with other positions of the parties, ÖVP and FPÖ, and we were kind of avant-garde those days, the first right conservative government with the right-wing party, and there was a big protest going on within the European member states, and we are facing a different Europe right now, and we were chatting about that even a year ago we all thought that the European leaders are going to prepare the European Union to be Trump-proof, to have kind of shield against what is the world going to face soon from now. And now we are facing a Europe that is trying to be Trump-ready, which also includes policy, female policy, women policy, the policy of gender budgeting, and the way of how to distribute and support gender equality with the budget. But going back to the European Union and to the EU budget possibilities and the situation right there, what tools or strategies could enhance the impact of an advanced and progressive gender-responsive policy. Und ich möchte ganz kurz nur auf Deutsch übersetzen. Wir hatten im Vorfeld kurz...
So just before we started the symposium, we had a chat, and 25 years ago, for the first time, the conservatives and the right-wing parties rose to power, which met with a lot of resistance, a lot of protest, and now we are in a Europe where this has become quite normal. And 1 year ago we thought that we would have to defend ourselves, we would have to erect an anti-Trump shield, and now we have the feeling that the EU is getting Trump ready. And so I would like to ask you, what can the EU do as a superordinate power, especially in terms of budget? How can the EU budget be used in order to anchor equal opportunity policies in national budgets?
The opportunity to participate in this discussion. There is the good news and the bad news. The good news is that Austria is not alone. There is there is also the European Union, And it's true that this event is unique. Not too many countries can organize such a great event like the Barbara-Prammer-Symposium. At the same time, many other countries, I would say most other countries, also struggle with the same questions. How to promote gender equality in difficult times, how to retain the achievements, and uphold women's rights at a time when the political wind is coming against. And the political wind is not simply intra-European in this time, but also transatlantic, but that would be a separate question. I think it's we don't have time to elaborate on this, but indeed, on your original point, 25 years ago, Austria was an outlier with a government coalition of the center-right and the far-right. Now, half of the EU countries have one way or another a similar situation, either an outright coalition between the center-right and the far-right, or the direct threat of this. And obviously, this is a completely different landscape, also from the point of view of gender equality. But from a budgetary point of view, which is the topic of the day, indeed, the bad news is that the European Union is either an organization which also imposes constraints and not only promotes good ideas, and that very much applies to the fiscal territory. Andreas was talking about the fiscal debates that took place in this country in the recent months, and this is partly because the European Union upholds a certain fiscal framework. This fiscal framework has the capacity to enforce deficit reduction. And let's be honest, never there has been a serious audit of these deficit reductions which are enforced by the European Union from the point of view of the impact on gender equality. So I think this is a very important task, potentially for FEPS. There are two members of the FEPS leadership here, Zita and Maria, so maybe this can also be discussed. Really to seriously audit, historically as well, not only in the current year, if there are deficit reductions imposed, which can result in tax increases, but also expenditure cuts in the public sector, how it impacts gender equality, because that would expose the responsibility of the European Union and prescribe that in the next round, when the fiscal rules are discussed or even revised, this would be taken into account, because in the recent years there was a little revision of the fiscal rules as they were phased back after the corona, because the corona recession and fiscal rules were suspended. But I'm sure there will be another round and another round of revising the fiscal rules, and the question of gender should be much more important than in the past. Can I? Yeah, that's good news. Yes. On the other point, that whether the European Union is using its power, including its budgetary power, to promote to promote gender equality, the real test is coming now. What does it mean? That the EU in the last 5 years has had a gender equality strategy, which already resulted in many initiatives, important ones, including legislative, but the mother of all debates is just coming. I can use this expression in this environment. The budgetary debate. The EU has a 7-year budgetary planning, and the current 7-year budget will run until 27. So it very soon expires, and by that time, the new will have to be designed. So this debate will start this year. Austria also will have to be prepared to see how the budgetary power of the EU is used. I can tell you, on the basis of what the Court of Auditor reported, that only 2% of the EU budget is explicitly designated to investments, which are primarily linked to the question of the gender equality. So I'm not speaking about the size of the total EU budget, I'm just speaking about the share, which could be increased to explicitly designate projects, EU projects, to promoting gender equality, and also better ensure through conditionalities or the involvement of civil society that the rest of the EU budget also helps and doesn't obstruct.
Thank you very much, Laszlo. And wir haben hier im Saal eine Übersetzung.
Thank you very much, Laszlo. So we have interpretation here in the room. Laszlo shared with us that also within the constraints of the EU budget there are certain possibilities that are used to a limited extent for gender equality projects. Here there would be the possibility to increase these budgets. This is very important to me because many multipliers are watching. So the next budget that will be valid as of 2027 is treated already now. So it's very important to join forces with all players. Thank you very much for this extensive answer to my question, especially in light of we have seen in so many member states, well, it is all the more important to foster and use supranational instruments for gender equality. Please give it up once again for Doris Bures, Eva Maria Holz-Leitner and Laszlo Andor.
So year after year, it is wonderful to see that all our interlocutors and speakers could, of course, go on with their presentations. Unfortunately, we don't have time for that, but the Barbara-Prammer-Symposium means that we have a lot of input in a short period of time, and we're now looking forward to move on to the first of the two keynotes. We're very pleased that we have one Diane Elson. It's a Professor Emeritus, a retired professor from the famous University of Essex in Great Britain. She's with us here today, and she's now getting ready to give us her presentation. Let me briefly introduce her. She's one of the feminist voices of the British economy, a British feminist economist. She's a sociologist. She's the author of the book Budgeting for Women's Rights, Monitoring Government Budgets for Compliance with CEDAW. She worked as a special advisor for UNIFEM. She's the chairperson of the UK Women's Budget Group. She advises UN Women. She's a member of the UN Committee for Development Policy, and it is really a great honor to have her here today. So once again, please, a big round of applause.
Thank you very much for inviting me to this wonderful event. It's 10 years since I was last in Vienna, so I'm very pleased to be back again to this city, which is such a beacon across Europe for progressive policies. I bring you greetings from the UK Women's Budget Group, which is the leading feminist economics think tank in the UK, with which I've worked on a voluntary basis for the last 25 years. I also bring you solidarity, I think, from all the progressive groups that I work with in the UK, and thanks to FEPS for including still the UK within the networks, even though and we do hope maybe now we have a Labour government, we will start to think again about closer relationships with Europe, but we're relying on FEPS and on institutions like those gathered here to help us build the case for that. I bring you solidarity as well at this critical moment I hear in Austria, but also across many countries as to how are we going to resist, consolidate, not lose what we've gained. We were a bit hopeful in the UK now that we have a Labour government, but that government is under fierce attack now, attempts to destabilize it through the internet, through the money markets. So we can see you can never take for granted any steps forward. You always have to fight again and work again to try and consolidate as well as take forward. So I was asked to talk about a number of issues. Let me see if I can make this work. No. Yeah, I was asked to talk about gender-responsive budgeting, definitions and principles. I was asked to talk about key challenges for gender budgeting and gender budgeting in current global landscape, and also advancing gender budgeting in the particular circumstances that so many of us find ourselves. I don't think in the time I've got I'm going to be able to do all of these issues justice, and given what I've heard already this morning, I shall skip over some bits and concentrate more on others. I think you all know here, actually, the key arguments for gender-responsive budgeting. The governments have gender equality policy statements, lots of them, but they're frequently disconnected from budgets. And the gender-responsive budgets throw light on gender equality implications of how revenue is raised and money is allocated. And it can also promote greater effectiveness, transparency, and accountability in public finance, and social justice, because I think gender can be and should be considered in relation to class, ethnicity, age, and location. There are different practices, but common principles. Different European countries, different countries around the world that have adopted something they call gender budgeting, do it differently. There's not just one way of doing this, and there's a variety of tools and procedures according to the context and the objectives, and applied at different levels of government, national, regional, and city. And I think that issue of different levels of government becomes very important when we have changes at the national level, which are setbacks, but still at the local or the regional level, there may be more scope for progressive policies. We found that in the UK in the 14 years of centre and right-wing governments after 2010. We found that at national level, the opportunities were very constrained. I'll talk a bit more about that with some examples. But at regional level, there was much more opportunities. In Scotland, there was a progressive social democratic government, and there was much more scope there for women's organisations to have dialogue with the Scottish government, to, within the constrained fiscal situation of the Scottish government, they could nevertheless, there were certain things they could do, and they did do. So that gave us some hope. Follow the money, I think, is a key mantra for gender-responsive budgeting. And following the money from the budget to outcomes. The budget tells us about the money, how it's raised, how it's spent. It tells us about the inputs of expenditure. But of course, that has to be translated into the activities, the operation of care services, campaigns with men against domestic violence, delivery of welfare benefits, subsidies to ensure transport services meet women's needs. I was very interested to hear early on, I think it was Dora was talking about when she was a Minister for Infrastructure, working on this issue of subsidies to ensure that transport subsidies meet women's needs. So we have to look at what the activities are. We have to look at the outputs. That's where the measurement comes in. How many people are given care? What are the numbers of men reached by anti-violence messages? What's the value in the distribution of welfare benefits? What are the numbers of women able to access suitable public transport? So we have to have data at that point to see what the outputs are. Data that's not in the budget. You have to get that from another source. That's one of the challenges. But a lot of this data will be there in the ministries. And sometimes they say, well, we've got data. We know how many people are using public transport, but we don't know who they are. And then you have to get them, if that's the case, to improve the way they collect that data, so that they don't just say numbers of people, but they can tell you much more about who they are, their gender, their age, their location, their ethnicity, etc. And then, of course, we need to look at the gender equality outcomes. Is the way that the money is being raised and spent, is it reducing gender gaps in income? Is it reducing violence against women? Is it reducing gender gaps in unpaid care work? Is it transforming gender roles? And that's where we need data from surveys of various kinds. That's data that goes beyond what the administrative data for particular ministries or programs will have. That's where you need the time use survey. We had some reference to that earlier. That's where you need the household survey. That's where you need the labor force surveys. What are some of the key challenges? Well, according to the OECD, just over 60% of OECD countries now practice something they call gender budgeting, compared to fewer than half in 2015. So to some extent, we could see that as progress. But the quality and the impact of the efforts varies. And according to the OECD, key challenges arise when efforts are not led by the Ministry of Finance, because actually, I mean, it's the Ministry of Finance that's the powerful one over the budget. We need all the other ministries, but if you just put the responsibility on the Women's Ministry, they're never, ever going to have enough power. There's also problems if gender budgeting is implemented without sufficient capacity building, staff, data, guidance, and I'm sure lots of you here have been involved in that capacity building. But there's another challenge when governments think that the goal is producing rather than using information. I'm going to say a little bit, if I have time, about the example of Canada, but that's been one of the criticisms made there by feminists, that the government's put a lot of effort into producing a lot of information, but how much use has it made of that information? And there's a challenge if the approach isn't linked to a gender equality strategy and it doesn't prioritize key investments. So it becomes fetishized as just a process that you have to carry out because, I mean, there's a box to tick and you've got to show you've ticked that box, but it doesn't actually link to priority investments. And of course, the major challenge when the overall focus of fiscal policy is austerity, cutting expenditure, even while you might be reducing some taxes, but putting all the emphasis on cutting expenditure. And I'll say a little bit more about that challenge in a moment. I'm going to skip that one. So I'm going to move straight on to this issue of austerity and talk about strategies for looking at the impact of austerity programs. Austerity programs bring in a whole number of different elements. There's cuts to expenditure, cuts to welfare benefits, cuts to public services. There's a mixture of things on taxes. Often taxes like value-added tax are raised, generate a lot of revenue. But other taxes, like taxes which are on the better off people, are often reduced. And you always have to look carefully at when they say we've got to reduce the budget deficit, well, are they doing this? Are they cutting taxes as well as raising taxes in trying to do this? So you have to look at the tax side as well as the expenditure side. Well, in the UK, in the Women's Budget Group, we've had austerity policies for 14 years. And in the UK Women's Budget Group, we tried to measure the gender impact of a combination of policies, not just ministry by ministry, but trying to pull together the data to look at the big picture. There's a whole report on this that I've referenced on the slide that can be followed up. Anybody wants to read the details. Here, I'm just going to refer to what we did looking at the combination of the social security and the tax policies. So in the period 2010 to 2020, welfare benefits were cut severely with the aim of reducing the budget deficit. But some taxes were also cut. Now, the UK doesn't have a gender budget law. It's not like Austria, it's not like Canada. But it does have legislation requiring governments to, quote, pay due regard to the equalities impact of policies, including budgetary policies. And an important way that the government could demonstrate it's done this is to publish an assessment of the cumulative impact of policies on different social groups. But the government did not do that. So we in the Women's Budget Group stepped up to the plate, and we published an assessment of the incidence of these cuts to social security and changes to tax policies on income, on individual income, by gender, ethnicity, and class in the period from 2010 to 2020, using official data. So this was using official data sources. What did we find? We found it was important to look at the combined impact. And we weren't totally surprised to find that women lost more than men across all income groups and ethnicities. We heard earlier, I think, how austerity policies, women tend to lose more. They tend to lose more when welfare benefits are cut, because across all the countries I know, welfare benefits are more important for the living standards, for the incomes of women, because of the unpaid work that women have to do, because of the lower wages that women get. So cuts to welfare benefits is always likely to impact women more than men. But it's also important to look at this, I think, in terms of class and ethnicity. So we did that, and we found that who lost most? It was poor women who were British Asians. British Asian women lost the most, and they were already the group with the lowest income. The income gaps by gender, ethnicity, and class income group were set to widen. And to reduce these income gaps rather than widen them, a different approach to budget deficit reduction was needed, with more emphasis on taxing the better off. The cuts to welfare benefits since 2010 totaled 37 billion a year, 37 billion pounds a year by 2020, but tax cuts were even more. Tax cuts since 2010 cost 41 billion pounds a year by 2020. So we use that information to say, what do you mean there's no alternative? What do you mean we've got to reduce the budget deficit? What do you mean these welfare benefits have to be cut? And I think it's very important for all of us to be challenging that. Picking up what we heard earlier about the fiscal rules problem. Now, we've never been in the Eurozone in the UK, so we've never had the fiscal rules imposed in quite the same way as as countries in the Eurozone. But we've just had our own version, very, very similar fiscal rules, chosen by successive governments for very similar reasons. And I think this is going to be one of the challenges for us in gender budgeting, is to really take on the critique of these fiscal rules. What do they mean? Why are they there? What are the alternatives? Because that really, if we have these very narrowly defined fiscal rules, it really, really constrains what we can do in terms of budgeting for gender equality. And I hope that is something that progressive groups all across Europe will unite, those in the Eurozone and those not, because we all face a similar kind of problem. Some of the reasons are similar. The power of the financial markets is one important reason that needs to be challenged. Another reason is the short-sighted way in which economic modeling is carried out, so that the positive impacts of public expenditure on economic growth, for instance, are not taken into account, and public expenditure on public services and welfare benefits is only seen as a cost. It's not seen as an investment. And I want to return to that point if I have time later. Just to say a few words about gender budgeting in the current global landscape. Well, this is a very much on the one hand, on the other hand kind of assessment, because on the one hand, more governments than ever before claim to use gender budgeting, and international organizations like the OECD, the EU, the IMF, the World Bank promote gender budgeting, provide training in gender budgeting. But on the other hand, most of the governments who say they're doing gender budgeting have a very narrow approach to it. They focus primarily on expenditures explicitly targeted to women. They don't really link spending with the overall policies. They do not include taxation. We already heard this morning that it's going to be very important to look at taxation as well as expenditure. And they don't look at the macroeconomic dimensions of the budget, these fiscal rules. So it's going to be really important to get governments who say they're doing gender-responsive budgeting to move forward on these issues. I did an overview of what's happening around the world, and the list of references at the end of my slides has got the reference to that. Now, there's an OECD is doing a lot of reporting on gender-responsive budgeting, and they had a report out in 2023 that finds that among the OECD countries that say they are doing gender budgeting, it's Austria, Canada, Iceland, Ireland, and Norway who score top marks as far as the OECD is concerned. UK is not included in any of this because the UK government doesn't say it does gender budgeting, which it doesn't. So that's why you won't find them in the OECD tables. Now, I look at these OECD tables, and there is I'm not going to talk about this because I can see it's impossible for people to really read this table, but the OECD does this assessment based on a questionnaire, and as I say, the top marks go to Austria, Canada, Iceland, Ireland, and Norway. But I know when you go to a country and you talk to people and you ask what lies behind this, the government says it's doing all these things, what's actually happening, that the picture isn't quite as rosy as the OECD reports would have us believe. Well, you in Austria will know all about your challenges here. I looked a bit at Canada. I'm in touch with quite a few Canadian researchers. And so I said, okay, what lies behind the OECD evaluation? What about Canada? Now, like you, Canada has a gender budgeting in law. It has a Gender Budgeting Act passed in 2018, which incorporates something called gender-based analysis plus into the federal budget-making process. And they've done a lot of training, a lot of capacity building, a lot of working reports with this gender-based analysis plus. The plus bit is because this is an analysis that's not just on gender equality, it's also on other dimensions of equality, class, location, ethnicity, Indigenous Canadians, for instance, how is the budget affecting them? Now, of course, every government that's doing gender-responsive budgeting always says how well it's doing. So I wasn't surprised to find that the Canadian government says, yes, we're doing well because we've invested resources in strategic areas, fostering gender equality and inclusion, including early learning and childcare, a national action plan to end gender-based violence, a federal action plan on LGBTQI+ action, and an implementation of a national action plan to end the tragedy of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. Well, that's good that the government can say it's put investment in these areas, but it doesn't provide an analysis of how the GBA plus influence these priorities, nor how funding for these new initiatives compares with funding for other programs. So these programs are funded, but how does the funding compare with other programs? And does it meet all the needs that have been identified in these programs? So if you talk to researchers and to civil society, you get a somewhat less rosy view, where you get some of the shortcomings emerging. So one set of researchers describes the GBA plus process as a checkbox process. Lots of training, civil servants got to fill in a form, they all fill in the form, but does it really influence the way that policy is designed and implemented? Another critical view argues that the budgets made with the gender budgeting approach nevertheless still resulted in investments in infrastructure that would benefit male workers most, gendered forms of privatization, changes to caregiver and parental leave that would serve only the most privileged women, and major gaps in essential services, including childcare. And the Standing Senate Committee of the Canadian Parliament also produced a somewhat critical report saying that the implementation remains inconsistent and incomplete across government. So I think that's going to be a challenge in Canada, and they're facing their own political challenges too. Are they going to lose what they've got? Are they going to be able to build on what they've got and improve it so that some of these shortcomings are remedied? Let me now, the time I've got left, focus on the issue of advancing gender budgeting in the current circumstances. So first thing I want to talk about is making the case for investment in social infrastructure. So deliberately using the language of economists on this. So feminist economists categorize public services such as education, health, early years education and care, and social care as social infrastructure and spending on it as investment. They argue that like public spending on physical infrastructure, on roads, on telecoms, on electricity, even if it's green electricity, like that physical infrastructure, public spending on social infrastructure produces spillover benefits to the whole economy and to society as a whole, with streams of returns accruing over many years. So it's not a cost, it's an investment, and it's investment that doesn't just benefit the immediate users of those services, it benefits the wider society and the wider economy. And it also incentivizes private investment. That's often something that but we can't have all this public investment because it's going to take away money from private investment. Well, actually, the right kind of public investment incentivizes private investment by lowering costs, not just through physical infrastructure, but through social infrastructure. And there's some interesting research being done on this by feminist economists in the UK that shows that investment in better social infrastructure in the UK would not only create more jobs, but also increase productivity and generate increased tax revenue. So it may be that we need to put a bit more emphasis on developing this kind of argument about why we want to see certain kinds of public expenditure not cut, but enhanced. And if you cut them, well, you're going to be damaging the economy. It's not just an equality issue, we should say to them. It's a growth and productivity issue, and we might get perhaps a little bit more of a hearing. But we might not. We might not, because, of course, one of the challenges we also face is that good evidence doesn't necessarily win the arguments. So it's true, we have to bear that in mind. So we also have to talk about progressive taxation. And I think this is one of the tax side is one of the areas that's been unduly neglected in gender-responsive budgeting. And it's really, really important, I think, to bring it more to the fore, particularly in relation to taxation of wealth. Inequalities in wealth and income from wealth have grown much more than inequalities in earnings. They're particularly bad in the UK, not quite as bad as in the USA, but quite bad, and probably worse than you've got here. But nevertheless, all over the world, the inequality in wealth has grown. Now, all the data that we've got shows that men own considerably more wealth than women. So taxes on wealth and income from wealth are gender equitable as well as socially just. And Spain has introduced a progressive solidarity tax at the end of 2022 on very wealthy people, the top 0.5% of wealth owners. We're not talking about the middle class, we're not talking about small businesses, we're talking about the very rich who can easily afford this, the top 0.5% of wealth owners. And a tax of this kind can generate a lot of revenue. The Tax Justice Network has done an estimate for 172 countries and finds that a similar kind of tax to the one they've got in Spain on the wealth of the top 0.5% of the wealthiest would increase tax revenues by about 7.3% of their current revenues, so quite a sizable increase in tax revenues. And it would add up to more than $2.2 trillion globally. So the problem is not that there's no money, the problem is we haven't got it. So there will always be pushback because there'll always be an argument, oh, you're taxing the wealthy, you're stifling economic growth. But actually, I think there's a lot of evidence to say the kind of taxes you can do don't, and this might be something you can build a broad coalition of people to support. And I think, though, that has to be complemented by doing detailed national assessments of taxation from a gender equality perspective, focusing on how to raise more revenues through progressive taxation. And we did that in the UK Women's Budget Group for the UK to inform the incoming Labour government, and looked at all the taxes that you could use in a more progressive way and what would the gender equality perspectives be. And I think bringing together, I don't know if you've got such a report in Austria, looking at the whole tax system from a gender equality point of view, but I think it would be well worthwhile doing something like that if you haven't. I'm nearly coming to the end now. In the context in which we increasingly find ourselves, I think support for civil society gender budget analysis is important. I think we all got after me, the keynote speaker is from a civil society, a think tank. She's going to talk about that. I think all over we need to have more support for civil society gender budget analysis. And I'll just give you the example of the UK Women's Budget Group and how we kept alive some of these ideas during the unpropitious 14 years of austerity. We're a long-standing group, and we're a network of, as well as a think tank with staff, we're a network with trade unionists, with women from all different kind of women's organizations across the country, as well as from universities and research institutes. We had a successful engagement with the UK Labour government from 1997 to 2010, and we had regular dialogues with the Treasury, that's our name for the Ministry of Finance. And we did have some policy impact. But with the coalition and conservative governments from 2010 to 2024, that dialogue ended. We were never invited again to have any discussions with the Treasury. However, that didn't mean we gave up. What we found was parliamentarians, actually across the political parties, parliamentarians were interested in the analysis we were producing. And so the all-party parliamentary select committee on the Treasury and on equalities called for evidence from us and used it in their reports. I went along to Parliament to testify when they were having the hearings on the budget and that the Minister of Finance then had to respond to later on. So we found we could do that. Here, even if the government's not receptive, you might find there's parliamentary groups, and clearly the SPO parliamentary group will be receptive. There may be others. We also had extensive use by journalists of our reports. So we got things into the press, on the TV and radio, pointing out the kind of things about how bad austerity was being for women. So we were able, and at the regional levels, in Scotland and in Wales, we were able to work with more progressive governments and create regional equivalents of the UK Women's Budget Group. So there's one in Scotland now, there's one in Wales, there's one in Northern Ireland, and then we get together and have a conference once a year and learn from one another. But we are now engaging with the Labour government, and we're providing training for officials, although we have a lot of reservations about the fiscal policies that the government has adopted. So there are things you can do that civil society groups can do, even when at the national level things are very unpropitious. And I'm sure you'll be thinking here about the kind of work you can do along those lines. So my final slide is, the politics of gender budgeting, because it is politics in the end. Money, power, it's politics. There's a challenging political climate in many countries. You know only too well, but it's there in a lot of other countries. There's a backlash against gender equality in the context of increasing class inequality and xenophobia. But city and regional governments may retain commitment to gender equality and gender budgeting, even when national governments do not, as well as the UK. We've seen that in Australia, where pioneer at the federal level, change of government gets pushed to the bottom, but some of the states in Australia continue to do it, and now they have a Labour government again in Australia. They've reinstated it, and they're making very interesting use of it. But I do think we need to put the gender budgeting in the context of a social justice approach that can address class as well as gender and ethnicity, and show how taxing the rich can generate resources for investment in social justice overall, and build civil society capacity to conduct gender analysis of budgets and communicate those findings. And so let me end again with this kind of note of solidarity as you struggle with this difficult situation here. But you've got such long, particularly in Vienna, such long-standing and deep-rooted both civil society and political party resources on which you can draw that I'm sure you won't despair. And another quote from Gramsci, we had one earlier this morning: pessimism of the intelligence, but optimism of the will.
Herzlichen Dank.
Thank you very much.
And also thank you for sharing your keynote with us on paper, or as I was told, there will be a link to it afterwards. And ich denke, ganz viele der Informationen, die
So I think that many of the information that Diane has shared with us are not only encouraging, but they are also concrete instructions for action. And I think it's very good if we once again have the possibility to read up on some aspects and to retain some aspects and to use it when linking up with like-minded actors. Because for resistance, it is absolutely necessary to link up with other actors. You might have noticed it. So we were not able to stick to the time allotted to us, but I think we shouldn't be stricter than necessary in those strict times, and I think we should afford ourselves the luxury to speak up and to discuss as long as we want it, but we will try that with the next keynote. We will be able to stick to the time allotted to us. Thank you very much to Ms. Preschel, the third president of the State Diet of Lower Austria. Thank you very much. And it's very important that also she recharges her energy for her work in the State Diet. Gender Budgeting in Austria, Status Quo and Perspectives. This is the title of the next keynote speech by the chief economist of the Momentum Institute. Katharina Mader was an assistant professor at the Institute for Heterodox Economics at the Vienna University of Business and also a senior fellow at the University of Graz. Her research focuses on feminist economics the care economy and unpaid work, as well as financial and economic policy. She has received numerous awards for her research, including the Gabriele Prosanna Advancement Prize, the 16th Vienna Women's Prize, and the Käthe Leichter Prize. Katharina, we look forward to your keynote. So please give her a big round of applause. Thank you very much. So it would be great to be always announced by Sonja. As many here in the room might know that, well, we all thought that we would start from different political assumptions. I would have loved to talk about gender policy impetus at federal level, to talk about why we should take this instrument so seriously. Of course, the situation today is totally different. And I have to agree to a colleague of mine who said yesterday, well, if you want to talk about perspectives, just show a blank slide for 30 minutes. So I won't do that, I promise. So it's become quite clear to me that Section 13.3 of the Federal Constitution says that all government action that has to do with money streams having an impact on gender equality must be watched closely. Of course, the situation of democracy, of women's policy will change a lot in the future, and there will be many problems in the near future. But this is something that the great Rosa Luxemburg said today, because we've heard too many quotations from men, and this is why I want to quote Rosa Luxemburg. She said, "Such is life, and this is the way we have to accept it, with unflinching courage and with a smile, despite all the adverse circumstances." And I think this is something that we should absolutely do today. So I'm totally convinced that for a functioning gender budgeting, we not only need administration and government, but also an opposition claiming it time and again. And of course, we also need civil society, science, media that we need as a critical voice. So we should not be deterred by adverse circumstances, so we should provide an answer to all difficulties. This is something that the great Clara Zetkin said. Gender budgeting is among the things for which we need a lot of patience and for which we need a lot of lead time. The idea is much older than we might think. Gabriele Proft, one of the first female members of parliament on the occasion of the 10-year anniversary of the Republic of Austria, held the first women-specific budget speech, and she clearly showed how many services are provided by the female population, and she also pointed to the indirect taxes paid by women, doing all the unpaid work, doing all the care. So fast forward to now, and for the few of you who haven't been around way back then, so this is not age-based discrimination, so of course I do not want to rewrite history. I just want to provide you with a quick pen sketch of the history of gender budgeting and how it landed in the Austrian constitution. In the 2000s, then Finance Minister Grasser presented the zero deficit, as it was called, as the cornerstone of the government program. In 2001, a balanced budget was reached only because the states and municipalities generated a surplus and the federal government sold state companies. But still, the discussion on austerity package had been started. At a scientific and civil society level, women started to talk about the impact of austerity measures on the relationships between the genders, on the power relationships. And there was an important book, Women Generate Budget, State Finances from a Gender Perspective. This is an important book that was written, which was a very important impetus for taking gender budgeting seriously at all political levels, because even at the beginning of the 2000s, analyses showed two things. First of all, austerity policy is always rather driven by political interests than by systematic analyses. And secondly, austerity measures, Diane already mentioned it. Austerity measures, first and foremost, concern women and children, cuts in public spending and in-kind benefits. This means that women work more in care work, and they also do much more household work. In the 2000s, we have seen that especially as girls are concerned, that austerity measures hit girls extremely hard if you think about the introduction of study fees. And these are gender impacts of austerity measures that have been acclaimed already in the 2000s. And in the early 2000s, the so-called Austria Convention was started. So basically to keep the opposition parties busy, or on a less malicious note, to give them a bit more leeway to shape policies. So the conservative government promised a constitutional convention. What was the outcome? A financial constitution convention. But this is when already gender budgeting was mentioned on account of civil society commitment, but also on account of commitment within the SPO and within the Green Party. So the idea was to introduce legal obligations and thus preventing that each and every gender budgeting project has to be started from scratch. In the discussions, in the conventions, which might not be surprising, initial resistance was enormous, especially representatives of the federal states, and I checked back. So the only relevant woman was State Governor Waltraud Klasnik. The representatives of the state diets were the ones who denied their support. There was a lot of persuading, a lot of advocacy work, and this led to a situation where members of the convention could be persuaded, but not to that extent that gender budgeting was anchored in the documents. So in inverted commas, they only said in section 33 that all the political levels shall strive for actual equal treatment. Actual equal treatment of men and women has been anchored a second time in the Constitution in section 51, and negotiators thought that thus also the aims of gender budgeting had been mentioned. And when I did my research, I found something that is truly interesting. Many had thought that if we establish the framework that way, then we also create a possibility to give a new audit criterion to the Court of Auditors, checking administrative action and giving it a second audit criterion, that is equal treatment of men and women. But to cut the long story short, in 2005, the overall draft was produced. It was fixed in 2007, and it was to be implemented as of 2009. And so Austria was the first country that had set forth gender budgeting at a constitutional level, which has been a huge success of this convention to find consensus for anchoring of gender budgeting. I'm not quite sure if this has truly been a milestone for the history of Austrian financial constitution. I would doubt that from today's perspective. But what would humankind be if we were all devoid of hope? To quote Adelheid Popp, in theory, the anchoring of gender budgeting was surprisingly positive, but if we take a look at actual implementation from a historical perspective, it's not that satisfactory. A very important success was that it acted as a role model. We could show that these provisions were not dead letter, but in order to fill such a constitutional provision with life, we need much more than what had been provided by highly committed public administrators that had been lacking political support. So just one additional information, in 2009, the anchoring in the constitution had not been completed. As of 2013, also the budget law reform entered into force, and also the effect-based impact assessments. So at least one equal treatment aim had to be anchored in the budget. And still, well, 12 years after introduction of impact assessment and 15 years after introduction of gender budgeting, we have hardly seen improvement. If we take a look at the goals that have been reached and the goals that have not been reached, in 2013, 57% of all goals had been reached or even exceeded. Only 3% of the goals had not been reached. And of course, there was a massive trough during the corona pandemic, but in 2021 we had seen that the goals that had been achieved went down, and that 9% of the goals couldn't be achieved. So some important information: the budget service introduces, draws up a map every year, documented the aims that have been achieved at a federal level when it comes to gender budgeting. So it's really a good read. But the fact that gender budgeting doesn't really work in Austria can be traced back to many reasons. So I think the biggest problem is the lack of an overall strategy, and that all these subsections that we have, they are not reconciled. So these sections don't talk to each other, and I also see a huge gap, a huge problem when it comes to linking up the budget with the impact goals, so that financial resources are not linked up with the goals. Many of you might be surprised if I say that many goals have not been fulfilled, but there are many goals that are prepared every year, and they lack ambition. They definitely lack ambition. And if these goals are missed, and if they lack ambition, so basically there is no one who is responsible for consequences or sanctions. We already heard it. So we are lacking data, there is a dearth of data, so there is a lack of political responsibility, be it in a women's ministry, be it in the finance ministry, for example, and there is, of course, also a lack of transparency. We need more transparency for gender budgeting, basically for the representation of actual budgetary means. So from the budget documents, we cannot really read how much money has been spent on equal treatment goals. So you can scour the documents for days and you won't find any relevant information. And I think this is something that could be changed easily. So I stole this idea, a very important idea in this regard, from Vienna. So we just have to introduce a gender budgeting chapter. listing all the equal opportunities, equal treatment measures and aims, and everyone in the room could truly understand and assess the measures that have been taken by the government. So I think overall in Austria, when it comes to gender budgeting, well, I have to state that the successive crises that we have seen have also been a cause of the failure of gender budgeting, and that in 2009, gender budgeting actually should have taken off, and this is when the first big crisis rained down on us. And this was not really helpful for introducing gender budget. But every successive crisis has been used as an excuse for not doing something about gender budgeting. So we heard we will do it once we get a handle on inflation and so on and so forth. All these crises, and we have a few analyses, all these crises have shown us that 42% of corona payments have solely gone to women, that compensation for the bracket creep was to the benefit of men. And of course, this can be traced back to the fact that the gender pay gap is still huge in Austria. And I think there is a lot of work to do in this regard. If we are serious about gender budget, and without any doubt, already in 2009, more advocacy work would have been necessary in order to follow through with gender budgeting and to fill it with feminist contents. I have the feeling that the civil society and media ran out of breath. We all had the feeling that this instrument is firmly anchored at a constitutional level and that it would represent a surefire success. But this was not the case, unfortunately, and because this was not the case, well, and so this has led to the fact that gender budgeting is a strategy devoid of meaning. And once again, please do not get me wrong. Public administrators with a commitment for equal opportunities, well, they really gave their very best, but of course, leeway is restricted, especially if confronted with a lack of political support. Well, what would we need for gender budgeting to work? I would like to cut to the chase here. We need transparency, we need quality standards, resources, responsibilities, accountability, and mechanisms for sanction. And we also need to link up financial resources and impact goals. But for this, gender budgeting would have to be taken seriously by policy, and when it comes to tax reforms, aid packages, and consolidation measures. Because only this way, gender budgeting can really make a contribution to decreasing inequalities. And this is more important than ever because we are facing choppy and turbulent times. And this actually brings me to the blank slide when it comes to the perspectives. I think I have a few minutes to go. This is excellent. And I would like to mention a few very important points when it comes to gender budgeting. And I would like to talk about the few results that we heard yesterday when it comes to the austerity measures of the new government. What is important first and foremost? So it's very important to consolidate the budget when it comes to the revenues and when it comes to spending. This is not a leftist program. If we take a look at the history of budget consolidation in Austria, then we can see that this has always been a mix of revenue boost and spending cut. On average, so 44% of revenues were consolidated and 56% of spendings were cuts. There have been 9 big consolidation packages since the 1980s. And what is also very important in this regard is that the success of these consolidation measures always dependent heavily of the development of the economic cycle in the ensuing years. So if we take a look at the current recession, then these consolidation plans will not wash because they need stable economic cycles. So this doesn't have to do that much with gender budgeting, but I think we do not have to go that far back in the past. So we can also take a look at the medium-term fiscal structure plans of the other European countries. 22 of the 27 countries have already published them online. Only Malta and Romania have been consolidating as far as spendings are concerned. But there are doubts in Romania, of course. One country, Slovakia, has only been consolidating in terms of the revenues. And all the other countries have been consolidating in terms of spending and in terms of revenues. And this is what they should actually do. And in addition, in Parliament, but also at the level of civil society, it will be very important to take a close look at austerity measures once we have more information than the empty phrases presented yesterday. Historically speaking, in Austria, we have seen that each of the big consolidation waves have exacerbated inequalities which can be measured by the Gini coefficient, and each one of these consolidation measures has exacerbated inequalities. Each of these consolidation packages didn't really tell us that it wants to cut social spending, which actually happened. If we take a look at social spending, then we can see that for each of these austerity measures, there have been cuts. And if we take an even closer look, then we can see that this always concerned family benefits. And I think it's quite evident that this has to do a lot with gender budget, but in order to come full circle, this is something that we knew already in the early 2000s, that spending cuts hit women particularly hard, that the lack of investment in social infrastructure, Diane said it, will always exacerbate inequalities because it's still women that bear the brunt of a lack of social infrastructure when it comes to child care, for example. But we have also seen the following, and this is something that I would like to underline. In each austerity measure, after each consolidation measure in Austria, but not only in Austria, we've seen that there is an increase of the unpaid work provided by women, because somehow what the state is not providing has to be compensated for. And it's especially women that have to grapple most with decreases in in cuts in real wages. And all these consolidation measures also have had a negative effect on employment of women when it comes to unpaid work. And this is a very, very daunting task to counteract exactly these trends. We can do it as members of parliament, we can do it as members of civil society, as researchers, as media representatives, because what is at stake? It's about creating transparency. So there is one important woman that I would like to mention, Hannah Arendt. She talked a lot about totalitarian states. Maybe this quote is a bit drastic, but I would like to quote it anyway. The only rule that everyone in a totalitarian state can rely on, that apparatuses become less powerful as they become more public. Thank you very much.
Ein Riesenapplaus.
A huge round of applause for Katharina Mader. Thank you very much also for this really important lesson and also the exhortation from the scientific and the economic perspective to get us to act at the political level. So I think this is exactly what we expect from the Barbara-Prammer-Symposium year after year. And this was delivered in an excellent fashion, if I may say so. Dear Evie, would you like to come back and we'll do an outlook together for the afternoon, which strictly speaking has already started, more or less, but in any event, after our well-deserved lunch break until 1 o'clock, we'll split up into workshops until 3 o'clock. So what do you have in store? Well, the workshops will unfortunately not be available for the online participants, but maybe you can briefly listen in to what we're going to discuss this afternoon. Yes, right. Yes, Sonja. We are now standing between our schnitzel, our breaded pork chops, and the afternoon workshops. I'm not sure whether we have schnitzel at all. But anyway, we'll have our afternoon workshops. Yes, we'll have those. And we'll split into smaller groups because especially after these two very dense keynotes, we can maybe go into more detail in the various workshops. And I'm very pleased because this year they are very, very interesting, and they will also be moderated by excellent people. Workshop 1 will be about challenges and opportunities of gender budgeting here in Austria. So we managed to find Helmut Berger, who for a long time was the former head of the Parliamentary Budget Service, and I can tell you, as a member of Parliament, he was the one who was able to answer all the gender budgeting questions down to the last detail, and he always found the right figures to share with us. So Mr. Berger, we're very pleased to have you with us here today. In this group we'll also have Elfriede Fritz. She's a lawyer and a former chair of the working group on equal opportunities at the Federal Ministry of Finance. So highly relevant if we have the Federal Ministry of Finance, the inside perspective, and to also focus on the equality aspects. And a woman who will also be getting a lot of boost from us, Marina Hanke, a member of the Vienna City Council and chair of the Vienna Women's Council. So you'll get a boost and energy, and then we'll move towards the 27th of April for the municipal elections. And one wonderful woman is also going to be one of the participants, Jana Schultheis. She's a budget expert and economist. So she provides us with interesting insights and with her expertise. So thank you very much to Jana Schultheis for being part of this forum. The moderator will be Janine Heinz, who is a former collaborator of Sora Foresight. So she has accumulated a lot of expertise with the Equality Monitor, and she will be a fantastic facilitator, and she will also make sure that we have a good balance when it comes to the statements made by the participants. Workshop 2, Promoting Progress and Overcoming Challenges. We have been able to win Marion Böker. She is a director when it comes to gender equality issues and fiscal policy. She's a woman with incredible expertise and a lot of knowledge and know-how, together with Elisabeth Grossman, a member of the European Parliament. She will be moderating this discussion, and actually the moderator will be Ruth Manninger from the SPO Federal Women. And the third workshop will be designed a bit differently. It will be a panel discussion. And those of you who know the Barbara-Prammer-Symposium will know that we also have some English language participants. This will be about gender budgeting at the local and global level. It will be in English, and we have Annika Dahlén, a gender equality officer of the city of Umeå in Sweden. And She's connected online, and I'm really looking forward to have her there. We'll also have Ursula Bauer. She's sharing her expertise on gender budgeting from the city of Vienna. And we have Kata Tüto, Deputy Mayor of Budapest, who has also joined us meanwhile. So a cordial welcome at this point to Kata Tüto. We are very pleased to have you here. Zita Gurmai, the his women president, will be there, and I will be the moderator. And the moderator will be Letizia Thyssen from FEBS, and Eva Maria Holzleitner will be a participant. She's the president of the SPO Women. Okay, thank you very much. The panel discussion will be organized here in the room to make sure that we can also use the interpreters. And at 3 o'clock, we'll have a summary of all the workshop reports. And I think the various rapporteurs on the workshop will report back from their workshops. And yes, you will be there until the end. Okay, so you will give us some concluding remarks. At this point, I would like to thank you for allowing me to be the moderator of the public part of this event. I would like to thank all the online participants. I've said it at the beginning, and I'll repeat it after the Barbara-Prammer-Symposium. There will be a summary of the workshop results, so it is well worth checking our homepage on a regular basis. And if you're interested in the results of today's workshops, well, all the keynote presentations will be shared as well on this platform. And I hope that we can all recharge our batteries to make sure that we are in it for the long haul. Thank you for this very constructive feminist afternoon, and a cordial friendship from me. And at this point, I did not leave the stage quite consciously, because of course we also need to thank somebody else, namely our moderator, Sonja Kato. Thank you very much for your always very professional moderation, because there's a difference whether you have a woman on the stage who does this with a lot of passion and expertise or not. And she is also a birthday girl. So happy birthday, dear Sonja. Thank you very much for your professional support and moderation here. Now we'll have a lunch break with or without schnitzel, whatever. So enjoy your lunch break and have a good workshop.